Good afternoon. We are delighted and honored that our conversation continues and that we'll be in the hands of three extraordinarily able and powerful speakers and experts on the issues of religious freedom and Muslim minority communities around the world. As Tom Banshoff began the conference earlier today, he noted that the theme, the inspiration for this conference is, we have to confess, the grave issue that faces many people around the world, namely the extent to which religious freedom is under threat around the world. That is the somber backdrop to these proceedings, as congenial as they are. The backdrop to our conversation is the sad, the grim reality, the grave crisis for many people across the world, and particularly our focus today is on the grave crisis that Muslim minority communities face with respect to their religious freedom, especially in the United States and Western Europe, but also across the world. Many of us are mindful, but not sufficiently mindful, I would suggest, of the extent to which Muslim communities across the world face very grave threats, not only to their religious freedom, but even to their survival. Countries such as India, Burma, in the last few months, Central African Republic, have all seen horrific attacks on Muslim minorities from governments as well as from social groups. Just last week, I noted that a Hindu nationalist group in India, in the great city of Agra, where the Taj Mahal is located, attempted to forcibly reconvert 200 Muslims, so-called reconvert, to Hinduism. And these kinds of efforts to coercively convert Muslims to Hinduism are happening all the time now in India, the world's largest democracy. To discuss these grave issues, again, we are delighted that we have this extraordinary panel. I'm not so much going to introduce the three panelists as introduce Professor Robert George, who has, we're delighted, agreed to moderate this stellar panel. Professor Robert George, we are delighted to welcome back to an event hosted by the Religious Freedom Project. We hosted Professor George a couple of years ago, and we're delighted that he has agreed to return. And we're delighted that, for many reasons, Professor George is really the ideal person to lead this panel conversation. He is an extraordinary scholar and teacher of the very issues we'll be discussing today, issues of constitutional rights, issues of natural rights, issues of the relationship between freedom and morality. He's a legendary teacher at Princeton, winner of numerous teaching awards. He's also a stalwart, articulate advocate for religious freedom. He recently served as chairperson of the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, a role he took extremely seriously and advocated vigorously on behalf of persecuted religious communities across the world, including Muslim communities. Perhaps the most important element of his biography for today's proceedings is that he's also a bluegrass banjo player. Unfortunately, Professor George has not brought his bluegrass banjo, but we hope that he'll do that on another occasion. Would I think add a certain kind of congenial spirit to the proceedings. We'll have to ask you to do that next time, Professor George. And I noted that he was part of a group called Robbie, George, and Friends at Swarthmore. And I'm hoping the conversation today will go so well that we could call the three of you Robbie, George, and Friends. Well, we'll have to see. Also, perhaps most importantly for today's proceedings, is that Professor George has been a consistent builder of interreligious bridges in the last few years, particularly with our Muslim friends, leaders of the Muslim community. He has worked tirelessly to work with Muslim groups, leaders, public intellectuals, to promote shared values around the sanctity of life, around marriage and the family, and, important for today's purposes, around religious freedom. And I know that an important inspiration for Professor George has been these words, that he has often quoted, that he's reminded us of, words from the Second Vatican Council, from the great document Nostra Aetate. The Church, the document says, the Catholic Church has also a high regard for the Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, who has also spoken to men. They strive to submit themselves without reserve to the decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan, to whose faith Muslims link their own. Although not acknowledging Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. His virgin mother they also honor, and even at times devoutly invoke. Further, they await the day of judgment and the reward of God following the resurrection of the dead. For this reason, they highly esteem an upright life and worship God, especially by way of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. Nostra Aetate, the document goes on, over the centuries, many quarrels and dissensions have arisen between Christians and Muslims. Remarkable understatement in the document. The document goes on, the Sacred Council now pleads with all to forget the past and urges that a sincere effort be made to achieve mutual understanding for the benefit of all men. Let them together preserve and promote peace, liberty, social justice, and moral values. I only add that Professor George has not only quoted those words, but has acted on them. He has consistently advocated for closer cooperation between Muslims and Christians and other religious groups to advance freedom of conscience for all. He has also, I should add, denounced those people who have attacked Muslims and have attacked their loyalty, have attacked their commitment to values of freedom, and he's gone out of his way to criticize politicians who have tried to stir up Islamophobic sentiment. So in many, many ways, Professor George is an ideal person to lead us in our discussion of Muslim minorities and religious freedom. So please join me in welcoming Professor Robert George and the distinguished panel, Professor John Esposito and Shaykh Hamza Yusuf.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. May God the Almighty and Merciful be praised for bringing all of us together, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, laborers in the same vineyard, working for the important values that must be advanced not only here in our own country but across the globe, beginning with the fundamental freedom of people to worship God as conscience dictates in freedom and security. It's a very great honor for me to be here, especially with my distinguished co-panelists. And I want to congratulate the center, and especially Tom Bonchoff, Thomas Farr, and Timothy Shaw for their wisdom in gathering us together across these historic lines of religious difference to share our best thoughts about the way forward for us, about the ways that we can cooperate in pursuit of those common values to which the great document Nostra Aetate, which was quoted by Tim, refers. I promise that on the next occasion that we're together, I will bring my banjo if Hamza will bring his dobro, or at least his brother's dobro to join me. My very first obligation is a pleasant one, and that's to introduce my fellow panelists. Professor John Esposito is University Professor of Religion and International Affairs, and Professor of Islamic Studies here at Georgetown, where he's the founding director of the Prince Alawid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. He's a very distinguished scholar in the field. He has been president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies. He's currently a member of the high-level group of UN Alliance of Civilizations, a body of 20 international leaders that guides the Alliance's work. He has written many books, including most recently Islamophobia, The Challenges of Pluralism in the 21st Century. Among his honors is the American Academy of Religion's Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion, which he received in 2005. And it's a very special joy always to be with, and today to introduce my beloved friend, my brother, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. Shaykh Hamza is an American-born Muslim scholar and educator and one of the founders and currently the president of Zaytuna College, and that's our nation's very first accredited Muslim institution of higher learning.
We're actually, I'm meeting with the commission on the 16th of February, so pray for me.
Okay, yes, absolutely. I know why the prayers are needed as well. It was preceded by the 1996 founding of the Zaytuna Institute, committed to presenting a classical picture of Islam in the West and reviving traditional study methods and the sciences of Islam. He became a Muslim back in the mid-1970s and spent 10 years in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and in North and West Africa, receiving teaching licenses in Islamic subjects. He then returned to the United States, where he earned degrees in religious studies and healthcare. He is the first American lecturer to teach in the Morocco's most prestigious and oldest university. He also advises Stanford University's program in Islamic Studies and the Center for Islamic Studies at Berkley's famous graduate theological union. He was one of the 138 Muslim signatories of a common word between us and you, which was the very respectful response, the acceptance of the invitation for engagement with Pope Benedict XVI after his famous and very controversial Regensburg address. And that engagement, that outreach, that willingness to talk is exactly what Hamza is known for, and the example that he sets to all of us, not simply to his fellow Muslims, but to Christians and Jews, and really all believers and people of goodwill. Hamza and I have had opportunities to collaborate on projects where we are pursuing values that are shared by the Islamic and Christian traditions. We have worked together, for example, in the cause of fighting against pornography, the horrible plague of pornography, which is causing so much devastation in our country, devastation that should be as obvious as the nose in front of your face, and yet it's passed over in silence. And of course, we've worked together on the very issues that we're here talking about today, fighting against unjust discrimination, against persecution, and for the free exercise of religion, not only for people of his faith or my faith, but for people of all faiths. Why do we do that? Why do we fight for those important freedoms? Not despite being a Muslim or despite being a Christian, but because he is a Muslim and because I am a Christian. We are motivated by our faith to reach out in respect, to defend even people who have a different point of view. And so with those introductions, I will now open us up with some questions. I'll go on for a bit and encourage some discussion here on the dais, and then we'll reserve a few minutes toward the end for some Q&A with the audience. Both John and Hamza, and I'll ask John to comment first and then Hamza, but the question really is for both of you. As you look now at the situation for Muslims in the West, let's begin in the West, and then we're going to talk about the situation for Muslims in the Middle East and elsewhere. But in the U.S. and in Europe, what is your sense of the state of Muslim communities? How are these communities faring? What problems do they face from the outside? What problems are coming from inside the communities? And how well are these communities addressing their problems? John, what's your sense?
Well, I think that I would separate out the U.S. And Europe in terms of my comments. With regard to the U.S., major polling data done by Gallup and others show that at this juncture, not 10, 20, 30 years ago, but at this juncture, Muslims are educationally and economically and increasingly politically integrated into American society. And indeed, in some polls, on the one hand, many do say that either they or members of their family or friends or somebody from their mosque have experienced problems with regard to their civil liberties. But they remain generally quite optimistic. But the civil liberties issues are there, and the growth of Islamophobia is there. Our center is launching a 5-year study called Pluralism, Diversity, and Islamophobia because we see that rather than it going away, it's still very much part of almost the fabric of our society. One need only think of recent presidential and congressional elections or look at media, and certainly social media. The situation in Europe is generally a bit different in the sense that European Muslims, many of them, came quite a few years ago, came from more rural areas, came as laborers and workers primarily, and had a lot of the educational and social disadvantages that immigrant Muslims in America did not have. And here one has to distinguish between the African American experience and the immigrant Muslim experience. But the immigrant Muslim experience here were people who years ago fled for political reasons or for a better life, but also in recent years, those that came for education didn't go back. And so you have a different profile educationally and professionally, more of a chance to fast track, certainly in recent years. The European situation is still a problem. And the background for that community to begin to fast track varies depending on what country they're in. But certainly, if you take a look at the UK, if you take a look at the Netherlands, at Germany and France, there are problems. But again, that varies from country to country.
Hamza?
Well, there's a lot of ways we could categorize the Muslim community. Just to look at America in the first place, I mean, I'm just going to give 3 basic categories. You have indigenous African American Muslims, and that community is also diverse. So you can't lump that community together either, because you have, for instance, Warithuddin Muhammad's community, which has really been highly integrated for a long time, and I think Warithuddin Muhammad was definitely ahead of his time in dealing with a lot of the issues that we're grappling with now as a community. And then you have Salafi African Americans. You have a prison community that's quite extensive, African American Muslim prison community.
Hamza, can I interrupt on that
Yeah.
point? Is that community mainly people who have been converted to the faith in prison?
Well, a lot of them converted in prison, and with the Warithuddin Muhammad's community has now 2nd and 3rd generation, because they've got a lot of people that have been born into Muslim families. Their families converted in the 50s or 60s. So, and then you have a highly educated, really Cold War immigrants that came in the post-1965 Johnson's Immigration Act that enabled people to come from India, from South Asia, from the Arab countries. And these are really highly educated. Many of them had PhDs, engineers, physicians, highly integrated into the community. And then you have the 7-Eleven owners, the taxi drivers, the people that are the brunt of jokes on The Simpsons. And I don't know if people remember the 2 Bengali characters that Dave Letterman used to bring on, where people could laugh at their accents and things like that. So that's kind of that's a very broad strokes look at what's out there. And then you have interesting, like the Vietnamese Muslim community. You have these funny pockets of unusual immigrant communities that come. Overall, in the United States, the Muslim community is actually doing, I think, exceptionally well financially and professionally. In terms of the religious community, which represents, and I think John probably knows these numbers a lot better than I, but I think it's probably around 15% have some kind of affiliation with the mosque, whereas you're dealing with 85% of the Muslim community that is actually not a religious community, and yet gets lumped in with the Muslim community that are religiously committed, as they end up getting on these no-fly lists because their names happen to be the same as somebody else's name. I mean, I literally bumped into Yusuf Islam, who was formerly Cat Stevens, going through the security yesterday, and he was being, patted down, and I was really surprised. But they had apparently they go through it all the time. So it was really upsetting for me to see that. So there's a lot of Muslims that go through these. So from that aspect, now to look at the problems that we're facing from the outside, in many ways, there's two major problems. One is what happens in the Muslim world, because all of that comes back. Like what's happening in Sydney right now affects Muslims here. And Fox News and other, and increasingly the more liberal news stations, including CNN, are becoming, the rhetoric's changing. Like we're noting of late a change in the rhetoric. So I think that's a major problem, what's happening in the Muslim world to break down these failed states in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, the rise of ISIS, which has kind of really, in some ways, renewed all of the trauma of 9/11 and these beheadings that we're seeing, despite the fact that people forget thousands of beheadings, south of our border have been going on with the drogadores, that we're not invading Mexico over all the beheadings that have gone down in Juarez and these places, or the 43 students that were recently killed. So, and there's, to me, a lot of similarities between these two forces working, ISIS and this force in Mexico. So from that point of view, that's one of the major problems that we're facing. The other one, I think, is the Islamophobic rhetoric that's been going on in this country for a long time. I first took note of it in 1993 when I bought at Safeway, and it troubled me that it was at Safeway, but it's a book by Robert Morley called Islamic Invasion. And it just struck me as what was it doing in Safeway, of all places. It was just so weird to see a book like that. And I bought it, and fortunately these books used to be so poorly written, but increasingly they're getting better writers to write these books. But the book really troubled me because it was presenting, if you read Hal Lindsey back in the 1970s, the late great Planet Earth, he's rewritten these books by doing a search and replace for the Russians and put Muslims in the place. Literally you can read his latest version, and it's just, he replaced Islam for Russia and the communists. And Arnold Toynbee said 50 or 60 years ago, that he was writing about Russia, and he said, before we had Russia as the enemy, Islam played the role of the bugbear for the West. And it may be in the future that role will return again. So, the prescience of Toynbee always fascinates me when you read.
What about Europe? What's your assessment
I
of Europe?
think Europe they are children of not the Cold War, but colonialism. And so a lot of them were actually brought into Europe to rebuild Europe after the devastation of World War II. And so they were more laborers. They weren't the kind of brain drain that occurred in the United States, where we took a lot of the best and the brightest from the Muslim world. They were the laborers from villages in Pakistan and places like that. And for a long time, they survived in their kind of ghettoized cultures. And I remember, because I lived in England in the late 70s and went up to Bradford and visited Sufi Abdullah's community. They used to have a big Mawlid parade, and they would march down the main street in Birmingham with all these thousands of Muslims singing prayer on the Prophet. And the English weren't bothered by that at all. But I think things have changed radically now, and I think the racism, the increasing racism, and the disenfranchisement, because a lot of these people came with all these traditional values from their own countries, and they had a lot of just basic human civility and things like this. But now they've got children that have grown up in very difficult circumstances, not dissimilar to what we face in a lot of the inner cities in America. And it breeds a different type of character who reacts differently when he's aggressed upon.
Okay. John, what about the news reports that we hear about recruitment by radical violent organizations like ISIS in Europe, in the United States? In the United States, it seems to be fairly localized, largely Somali, if I have a correct reading on it. Is that just a kind of relatively small level constant, or is that something that has increased? And if so, what seems to cause the increase? What makes it attractive for Western Muslims to join up?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors, but for example, if you take a look at the European situation, for a number of years I was on the European Commission's, I guess you would call it, its panel on de-radicalization. A lot of studies were done. And what you saw there were that the drivers, generally speaking, were not primarily religious. That is what really, a lot of it had to do, for many of them, with a sense of alienation from society, with regard to media, with regard to what was going on in the Muslim world, with regard to the way they were being, the experience they were having. Might have been born in Britain, but always being treated as if one is a foreigner. And I think that those kinds of issues can play. Mehdi Hassan did a piece recently in which he referred to two fellows who were going to Syria, didn't get there. They were arrested. But what was noted was that they had ordered on Amazon Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. Meaning that they
didn't know much about it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there are other things that attract also.
And admittingly dummies, which is quite good.
Yeah. I know. I sent them my books too, and it didn't make a difference. But the reality of it is that that those drivers are there. Religion can then be clearly used as a legitimator, as a motivator. And we do see the numbers in some European countries that are a serious matter of concern, particularly in places like France, and also in Britain. In the U.S., our issue often with what would be called domestic, homegrown, have often been people who go over to fight overseas. So, for example, you had Somalis going to fight in Somalia. You had, in this area, some young Washington-born or Washington area-born young people going to fight in Pakistan, but not committing any actions within the country. And our numbers still remain very, very small if one thinks about, relatively speaking, the size of the community. One final point I really want to underscore, because nobody ever points to it, and that's the point you made about how many Muslims are associated with the mosque officially. And also the notion that you have a lot who would see that they would consider themselves cultural Muslims. Right. So they don't really get involved in the religious side. And yet in our society, we've transcended that when we talk about Christians or Jews in any situation. So we don't, first of all, we don't look to identify when we're talking about criminals or something happens and say, well, this was, a Christian, so the number of Christians who are in prison are X, or the number of... I find in a lot of situations in the last 20 years, people ask me the same question, and that is, how many Muslims are there in America? But when you answer it with many of them, you know that the number of Muslims constitutes the magnitude of the problem, quote, of the problem, because they don't have a sense of the diversity of the Muslim community.
Yeah. And by diversity, you mean not simply national or ethnic diversity. You
That's
mean
right.
diversity when it comes to religious activity.
Yeah.
Religious practice.
Well, I have to say I'm rather stunned that the percentage is as low as 15%. Now,
I mean, that's about accurate, isn't it? 15.
Yeah.
Maybe the Eid, what you would call Christmas, Easter Christians,
yeah.
or Hanukkah Muslim, or Hanukkah Jews. It's probably 25%, maybe a little higher.
Well, that raises another question for me then.
Religion's in bad shape.
Yeah, well, I mean, among observant Jews, among devout Christians, living in our society and enjoying its freedoms and its pluralism and its many advantages, there's a grave concern, especially with the with the millennial generation, that secularism, the ideology of secularism, is now so much suffusing our culture that it's very difficult for us to transmit our faith to the next generation.
Well,
Hamza, what is your own normative, what's your prescription for the proper role of Islam in the life of the Islamic citizen of, let's say, the United States, of a liberal democratic regime? How should Islam impact his life as a citizen? I'm asking you to wrestle with a kind of issue that in Christianity, Richard Newhouse famously wrestled with. In Judaism, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has wrestled with quite brilliantly in England. To what extent should it affect your citizenship that you happen to be a Muslim?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that one of the major problems that we have in this issue is a lack of understanding that throughout history, Muslims have always lived as minorities in non-Muslim countries. I mean, there has been a continual, this idea that Muslims have only lived where they dominated is completely false. And one of the biggest problems that happened in Andalusia after the collapse of the Muslim polities there is that the Muslims stayed there for a few hundred years. And Cervantes, you'll note these people hiding out in the mountains throughout Don Quixote, very interesting characters because he lived in that period of the Inquisition and everybody was afraid. The Moriscos, they were hiding out in Las Pujeras and these other places. But one of the things they grappled with was how to be a Muslim when you're living in non-Muslim lands. And 15 years ago, I brought Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah over here, who's one of the preeminent scholars of jurisprudence, meaning really the philosophy of Islamic law, akin to constitutional law in our culture. And he did a program which we entitled Sacred Law in Secular Lands. And it was really grappling with this idea of what our religion says about living in a secular state. And one of the things that he said, that it was obligatory for Muslims to be engaged civically with the society, and that their faith compelled them to that. And he said that we have a concept in usul, Islamic jurisprudence, of taking the lesser of two evils. So even with two candidates, both of whom you're not really pleased with, but you look at which one is going to be better. And he talked about the importance of the common weal, that we shouldn't only regard our own community, but thinking of the common weal in general, of what's the best thing for the society. So I think, our faith should compel us to that. And the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was somebody who was profoundly concerned about the human condition and all human beings. And I recently read Imam Sha'rani said that one of the things that he realized in his own state was the mercy of the Prophet. And he said this was a mercy to all of creation. And he said it even compelled me to treat inanimate objects gently. I mean, this is one of the great spiritual masters of Islam. So he said, so I never put a cup down with any force. And so that was how Muslims understood the Prophet. I mean, this kind of violent transformations that's occurred in the Muslim world is really very alien to the spirit of certainly scholastic Islam that had a huge impact. And so I would say for us in the United States, I think it's our religion should compel us to the civic duties, of really being concerned about these things. And I emphasize local because I think at the federal level, it's very hard to change policy and to do things. But at local levels, you can do amazing things. I mean, because we have more of a direct democracy with public hearings, and people can really be involved. You can get gambling out of your communities if you have enough people to get behind these causes. So I think there's a lot that we could do. And then I think there's a lot, I would really like to see Muslims more engaged in some of the things that I know the Catholic community is deeply troubled with and that we've worked together on. Mm-hmm. And, people say that, somebody wrote something about me and we had a conversation. He said, like all religious people, he was obsessed with pornography. Which was a secular dig, that's fine. But, anybody who's looking out at our culture, I mean, if Sayyid Qutb was horrified by America of the 1940s because he saw men and women dancing closely together, that's how he describes it in the America I saw. I mean, what would he think if he came to America now? You know, I mean, seriously, it's amazing what's happened. And so I just, these things should, and you point out very well in Conscious and Its Enemies, you know, just that these things are not personal matters, that they concern all of us. They concern the nature of the culture that we're living in. And those of us who have children have an even more profound concern here because of the innocence that we would like to see them maintain as long as possible.
The interesting thing about that point that you're making is that when you actually look at, for example, data on different religions and their response to Islam, okay, among the most Islamophobic will often be what I called hardline Christians, okay,
Yeah.
who really emphasize, many of them, family values.
Right.
That are very close to what
most
many
Muslims,
Muslims emphasize as, okay, that's point one. Point two, with regard to the Prophet, what I find also interesting is that the way in which, the lens through which we look at Islam is never the way we look at other religions. So, for example, people bring up the fact that passages that deal with violence, and somehow they bypass the incredible number of passages in the Old Testament. Or I remember doing a New York interview, and the fellow said, well, yeah, but you know, but Muhammad was different. Muhammad was a warrior. And I thought, well, how about our biblical prophets? Yeah. Okay, at certain points in their actions, they were warriors, but we celebrate the whole person. And when you actually look at the prophet, because you were talking about this earlier, in terms
or
of
Jesus in the temple,
most
with the
of what she
changer.
emphasized, you know, it wasn't, you know, as it were, full-time warrior.
Yeah.
If you actually go back and look at how he responded, you know, to family situations.
And what's
others.
fascinating is in prophetic biography, the Maghazi was a distinct branch, you know, of his battles. And out of the 29 battles, there was actually fighting only in 11. The other ones, no fighting occurred. So this idea of violence in that period is crazy. But another, you know, interesting, and Doug Saunders points this out, and I don't know, you've probably read The Myth of the Muslim Tide, which I think is a really important book that was written by a Canadian journalist working in London who saw his neighborhood turn into a den of Muslims, and he was kind of concerned about what was happening. And when his French nanny converted to Islam, he noticed that she became more somber. And so he started studying it, and he looked at all these claims and found that they were completely false. And one of them was the violence of the Muslims. And here in the United States, they did a poll where they asked Muslims, American Muslims, if they thought bombing was ever justifiable. And 7%, troublingly for me, 7% that killed civilians. 7% of American Muslims polled said that it was sometimes, often or sometimes justifiable. 1% said that, you know, it was completely justifiable, and everybody else said never justifiable. So that's, you know, 92% said that it was. Well, what's interesting, when they polled Americans in general, 26% said that it was often or sometimes justifiable. So it was actually, you know, 3 times higher than the number of Muslims that thought it was justifiable. I mean, that's a pretty and 7% said it was completely justifiable. So, you know, we forget how violent a lot of our own citizens are in their attitudes about how to deal with problems. My experience in the Muslim world, with the exception, obviously, of these horrible places that have collapsed, but my experience has always been how amazingly peaceful Muslim societies are. And I have never felt in my time in Morocco, in my time in Egypt, before all this trouble began, I never felt at 1 in the morning walking down a street, and I never felt any fear. You know, and people pass by and say, "Salam alaikum, peace be upon you." You know, that was the greeting. Whereas I cannot say the same in San Francisco where I live. You know, when in fact somebody was coming at night and I was calling them every few minutes, just everything okay?
And yet the regimes that Americans are concerned about, especially on issues such as religious freedom, form for many Americans the image of what Islam is, the Iranian theocracy,
Right. And that term, theocracy, is a completely alien term to the Islamic tradition. No Muslims ever in the Usuli tradition have considered a Muslim government to rule by the authority. They saw it as that that there was a relationship, obviously, between the religion, but the judgments of the government were considered their own. And in Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet said, never, if you go to a city, never tell them that you will judge them by the ruling of God, but say that you will judge them by your own understanding. And he said, because it's easier for you to make a mistake about your own judgment than it is about God's. And that was very important to the Muslims, which is why they always put at the end of their legal opinions, God knows, and Allahu A'lam, God knows, because that was their attempt. And we forget that ijtihad, which is the legal reasoning process, exactly, yeah. The legal reasoning process of the Muslims, and they incorporated an incredible, I think it's a testimony to the genius of the Muslim jurists that they were able to deal with multiple interpretations. And you argue about judicial despotism and the problem of only having one legal interpretation for something. Muslims incorporated all these differences. And these are the things that need to be reestablished. But unfortunately, our tradition is ossified. We have great schools that have been destroyed, and the colonial period did a lot to damage them. But even before that, and not to blame colonialism, because I tend to adhere to Malik bin Nabi's idea of the susceptibility to colonialism as the primary problem. But these great schools are no longer producing independent thinkers to deal and grapple with the problems of modern society, because the complexities of modern society are so immense and so overwhelming, and we have people that are largely coming out of the least educated and the poorest strata of Muslim societies that are going into Islamic studies. The best and the brightest go into engineering and medicine, and this is simply a fact. And so we have a lot of really, really impoverished Muslim quote-unquote scholars.
And Zaytuna is a kind of response to that, right?
Zaytuna, it's interesting because initially we started out as a seminary, but what I really felt and realized, and we talked about this a lot with the other people that co-founded it with me, that what we needed was a liberal arts tradition, because the Islamic, and I would recommend, if you're really interested in this, to read John Walbridge's amazing work about the Caliphate of Reason, which was the centrality of the intellect in the Islamic tradition, and the centrality of logic, which was language and logic were the two central studies of all Islamic.
So when did the ossification begin?
Probably about, in different fields.
Is this a hundreds of years phenomenon or a decades?
It's been going on hundreds of years, yeah. But by the 19th century, it was in pretty bad shape. There's some areas, the Iranians, oddly enough, because they kept ijtihad alive, they've had a pretty vibrant tradition, I think, the Iranian Hausa tradition.
John, if you agree with what Hamza is saying.
I don't agree with anything he said.
I know, that's, I was saying I consider John a friend. I don't know what he considers me.
Is there a connection?
He's a contrarian, by the way.
What would the connection be between that ossification and the loss at the intellectual level and the oppression, the political failures of so many majority Muslim states? Is there a connection between that ossification, that loss at the intellectual level, and what we see in Pakistan and what we see in Iran and even in Saudi?
I think it's both the intellectual, but it's also overwhelmingly the political. I mean, what assured the continued ossification was basically the threat and then the reality of colonialism. Right. When in fact, when that happens, people circle the wagons. Religions tend to, pull back. Then you get independence in nation states, but you don't get what you expected. Instead, you wind up with authoritarian regimes, most of them supported by Western countries, that then also control or manipulate religion, the educational system. And so all of those things work against producing the kinds of citizens that you want, but also what they work towards is the culture of authoritarianism and the values of authoritarianism.
Right.
Yeah. And without that opening of society, which doesn't occur, you can wind up with what you see in Egypt now.
I want to save a little time for Q&A, but I want to get quick sort of lightning round type answers on a couple of questions. The first is this. Is there sentiment in, especially the American, but more broadly Western, the European and American Muslim communities, is there support for protecting Muslim minorities in particular in Muslim countries where Muslim minorities are being persecuted? The Ahmadi in Pakistan is obviously a very good example of this. Is there momentum, is there sentiment among Muslims here to support those victims?
I'd let you.
What lightning round? I'm
Okay.
bad at lightning.
I think that ironically, you mentioned that because I'm involved in a project that we'll be bringing people together tomorrow to talk about, which has to do with intrafaith Muslim relations. But in fact, one does see a very pluralistic approach in America that does not exist in majority countries overseas. There are problems with certain groups, and the Ahmadiyya have had problems and overseas. But here, in general, while one might not hang out with, an Ahmadiyya, some Muslims might not, it's not the kind of situation that was referred to before that exists in Pakistan and also at times exists in Indonesia.
Right.
Yeah. Hamza?
I think that Muslims right now are so embattled and so overwhelmed by so many issues, not to mention just surviving in the United States. Just people are, I know all the Silicon Valley people that I know work 80-hour weeks. So the areas of engagement right now that we're all strapped for funds, we're strapped for resources, I don't think that is high up, unfortunately, on the priority list in my experience. But it's sad to say, but I think that's a reality. People get really angry at me, and I get literally letters. I just got one a couple days ago, where they're so angry at me for condemning all the Muslim violence. And I never talk about the American violence, the Israeli violence. This is what they say in these letters. My response to that is I do talk about those other problems. Maybe you don't listen to those talks or something like that. But my concern is much more about how Muslims behave as somebody committed to the faith, because I see what it does to the faith, not just for people outside of the faith who begin to view Islam as this evil force in the world, but people inside the faith that are so gutted, and in the doldrums, literally, spiritual doldrums, where they just are really, you cannot imagine the amount of depression in the Muslim community right now. And I'm really deep depression, and people are overwhelmed, with what's happening. So, and I see people that have been completely incapacitated by what's happening, and it's just one thing after another. Now we've got Sydney, Australia. What's going to be next? It's one thing after another. So I think just getting Muslims motivated, getting them positive about things. I'm just trying to start a liberal arts college, to get them to think about things at a deeper level.
Well, it's very frustrating to me. It seems to me we have something of a chicken and egg. I've discussed this actually with Majid and with the folks at the IIIT. We have a little bit of a chicken and egg problem here. I think it would be a huge step forward for many Americans who simply don't understand their Muslim fellow citizens and are fearful of them. If they would see Muslims acting on the views they hold in so many areas where they share common values with ordinary people of different faiths. But then the other side of the problem is, it's what you point to. And Majid and I have discussed this as well. Muslims are so focused on surviving and dealing with people's fear, non-Muslims' fear of them, that they are reluctant to step out and bear any kind of witness in the public square beyond issues of protecting themselves against persecution or discrimination. So I would somehow like to break that vicious cycle.
But I think as with all significant social change, that social change takes place just as theological change. If you look at, for example, Vatican II, which was cited earlier, and the decades before, the small number of theologians that began to reinterpret Catholicism that went through persecution. Same thing's true with social change. And I think that I'm more optimistic, as much as the Islamophobia part is bad, and I think Muslims have a real reason to feel, concerned. I'm far more optimistic when I look at a lot of the younger generation coming along and what they're doing, and when I look at people like Imad and Majid and the kind of work that they're doing. I mean, I do see people being willing to speak out, but speaking out, we know this with all social movements in their early stages, it's not the majority of a community that speaks out. Because it's got to be people that know that there can be a cost.
Right.
Sure. Okay, floor is open. Yeah, you, sir. Do we have a microphone? So tell us who you are and where you're from.
Hello. Excuse me. Mohammed al-Sharif. I'm Egyptian by born, and I live in D.C.
He's an Azhari scholar, too.
I'm a learner of student of Shaykh Hamza and Professor Esposito and many beautiful faces around the room. And I really have my that's an honor for all of us. I think what we touched in, what the really Muslims can do in this very depressing time. I think Muslims, and I can just say that they don't have a room to speak. They are afraid of even speaking out, because as soon as they feel speaking out, they are being targeted, harassed, X, Y, and Z. So for us, the question is, how can we provide a venue for people to speak out? Because if you don't speak, if people can't speak, at some point they're gonna get violent. And I think Muslims in America, or especially in the West, they are so conflicted between what's happening in the Muslim world and what's happening in their own local communities. And we cannot distinguish both.
Right.
Well, I should let the panelists speak, but I can't resist saying, I think it's very important. Yes, Muslim public intellectuals and scholars and ordinary citizens must speak about issues pertaining to Islam. Obviously, that's true, including the problems that American Muslims suffer here. And yet, I think it is so critical for the general public to hear important Muslim figures, listen to important Muslim voices, speaking about issues other than Islam, speaking about the same sorts of issues that everybody else in America is worried about. And I think it's very important that they see.
Well, also, we don't just speak about Islam. We speak about violence in Islam. That's what I'm on this panel speaking about. This is what we speak about. Islam, I spend more time in the 10th century than I do in the 21st. I spend my time with...
My colleagues accuse me of that.
I spend my time with medieval minds that floor me on their intelligence. And we have what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. We're so convinced that this is the end-all of knowledge. A lot of the solutions to these problems that we're grappling with were dealt with centuries ago. They really were.
Let me give you data on this. Data. A study done by Media Tenor, which is based in Geneva, looked at 985,000 pieces of media from Europe and America over a 10-year period, from about 2003 to 2013. They found in 2003, when they looked at coverage of Muslims in the Muslim world, this is in general, not necessarily religion, 2% was on extremism, 0.1% was on, as it were, other things, mainstream Muslims. Jump 10 years later, 2% jumps to 28% on extremism, and the mainstream remains exactly the same, 0.1%, okay? Now you combine that with the explosion in social media with regard to anti-Muslim activities. The two major studies done in the last 4 years that show that close to $160 million has gone to these websites and these individuals. You're talking about one heck of a problem.
Right.
And it's below the radar. Most Americans aren't aware of that. I don't blame people although I get annoyed, who are sitting at home, who have busy lives, who aren't Muslims, and the only time they actually feel they're engaging in Islam is when they throw the TV on.
Let me give you a really, I saw just about, people's reactions and what the media does. I saw when I lived in Spain, I was in Granada, there was a man who stabbed a man because he insulted his mother. And there were witnesses that saw it and everything. The judge actually let him off.
Yeah, you should have.
Yeah, he let him off. See, Italian.
I'm Mediterranean.
He's an Italian,
Esposito,
right?
yeah.
Now, what's interesting to me,
I shot him. But
there are certain things that if you push buttons in certain cultures, you go down to Mexico and you call somebody's madre puta or something like that, see what happens. See what happens. People don't realize that religious identity is a very profound identity. It's more profound for a deeply religious person than racial identity. We cannot call people, the N-word or mix or kikes or all these words that used to be used, to the spics and these were common terms.
You're getting close. Be careful.
Yeah. They were common terms not that long ago in this culture, but they have been banished from public vocabulary. Why? Because people recognize that it's just something wrong about it, right? You can be critical of religion without being foul in speaking about another person's deepest beliefs. And until we kind of recognize that religious identity and racial identity have great similarities and we begin to respect religious identity in the public space, the things that are said about our prophet, I had a descendant of the prophet say to me, they're talking about my great-grandfather. Like he was taken not just as a believer, but as a direct descendant.
But when you have major political commentators that can say, convert them or kill them.
Yeah.
You see, you couldn't
if you
say
said
that about
the Jewish
Italian
community,
Americans,
anything,
about,
it's just
Jews, Catholics.
Noam Chomsky, pardon the quotation, doctor, but Noam Chomsky said, that the only acceptable racism now was against Muslims. It was just and if you just replace the words in the public space. Mm-hmm.
Matt Frank? Is there a microphone? Yep, there we go.
Hi, I'm Matt Frank from the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton. I'd like to ask both panelists about a problem that I see occurring in conservative circles and among a lot of Americans who are severely underinformed, undereducated about their fellow Americans who happen to be Muslims, and that's the so-called Sharia problem. Americans revere the rule of law and their constitution. Sure. Yeah. And so every once in a while when what I regard as absurd and outlandish fears and paranoias are fanned up about Sharia law, one sees proposals made in legislatures and town councils and so on to ban the recognition by judges of foreign law, and the subtext always is Sharia. And of course, I've looked into this and seen, that in the rare instances in which American judges have recognized Islamic legal principles, it's always in the realm of what lawyers call private law of family relations and so on. And these things
where
would
Catholic canon law,
Catholic canon law or Jewish law would be the analogy.
Yeah.
So I think there's an educational project here, and I wonder if you might comment on how to educate your fellow non-Muslim Americans about getting right with this.
It's a great question. The major problem that we have, I think, is just the term Sharia has become so emotive because it has been framed by a set of people on both sides. There's a certain Muslim framing of it that's happened by extremists, and then there's a framing that's happened by extremists from the other side, anti-Muslims. When Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah was here, and we were at the Adams Center, and Imam Majid was with us, somebody asked him, because some community down south, I think, was, quote unquote, implementing had punishment, which are these penal codes, in their personal community, right? And he was asked, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah was asked about that. What's the Sharia ruling? And he said, the Sharia ruling is that to implement the had punishment in the United States is against the Sharia. That the Sharia ruling is that there is no implementation. And that's what the problem is. The Penal Code of Islam, which is a tiny chapter in any, I've studied six books on Islamic law with teachers. The Penal Code is the smallest chapter. It's not even taught in many Muslim countries anymore. The scholars don't even teach it because it's not applicable. But these are called Ahkam al-Sultaniya, which are the rules that relate to polity, to government. It is prohibited to implement them by people that are not in government authority. And the bulk of the Sharia actually is marriage and commercial law. And the commercial laws would have solved a lot of our problems on Wall Street, right? Because if we actually implemented some of the Sharia premises, just about not tricking people.
But
right?
think about the news coverage that we have on the issue. And then think about how many shows have you seen where you've seen a real discussion about what Sharia is really about.
What is it, yeah.
I'm finishing a book for Oxford called What Everyone Needs to Know About Sharia. And I know you look disappointed, so you can look at my book, What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, and learn something about Sharia. But I mean, the fact is we don't see, whether it's on PBS or any place else where there's actually, you'll see the
Sharia,
the negative stereotyping. And it's not that there aren't issues when you start talking about whose interpretation of Sharia and how that is, put into place. You need to face those issues, but we have no context within which to understand that term.
The other thing about it is that the Sharia, in traditional classical Islamic law, the Sharia are principles. They're actually not statute. And so statute law, which is fiqh, is human. And this is something most Muslims don't understand, that actually the Sharia does not give specific laws except in rare situations like inheritance. Inheritance is one of the few areas, because there's so many human problems happen with inheritance, it breaks up families. So the inheritance laws in the Quran are they're completely laid out. So there's no fighting with families. But all the other laws that have come are there's so much debate in the tradition. It's a very rich tradition. And finally, the fear of having a Sharia, our law in this country is the Constitution of the United States. And so it's
impossible.
The thing, it's impossible. It's such an absurdity to say we need to make laws against Sharia, creeping Sharia. We already have a law against anything in the Islamic law that would go against American law, which is that you can't implement anything unconstitutional, even though, as Dr. George argues, many unconstitutional laws have come into existence.
Yes, that's true. I'm told we have time just for one more question. You, sir.
Hi, my name is Qudus Malik, and I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. And first of all, I just want to thank all three of you. It's such an honor for me to be at a function where all three of you are speaking, and I was so anxious to come here that I actually showed up here last week as well, on Monday. And I think that what the job that you guys are doing to try and remove misconceptions about Islam, and all three of you, I consider that to be a holy war, a jihad, and may God help you continue to be of help to you. The question I have is for Shaykh Hamza. You have publicly spoken on takfir, the practice prevalent amongst Muslim communities,
anathematization,
to try and declare other communities to be non-Muslim. And you've also gone publicly on record to say that you believe that Ahmadis are non-Muslim. My question is not really about the theological discussion around takfir, but once a community is declared non-Muslim, like the Ahmadiyya in Pakistan, do you think that Islam still allows the kind of criminal persecution of Ahmadis? So insisting that Ahmadis are non-Muslim, insisting that they can't use any Islamic terminology, saying that it's a trademark, forcing other Muslims to sign a passport form that says that they're non-Muslim. And the second question, very quickly, for Professor Esposito is that if there's ever a battle between religious freedom and ijma, the consensus, in Islam, who do you think wins? Thank you.
First of all, to answer the question, there's no such thing as collective takfir in Islam. You cannot say all this group are non-Muslims. Takfir is done on individuals. And there's a trial, there's a whole process, they're asked questions. So the idea of saying people are kafir is totally against the Islamic tradition. So I feel like I'm against religious persecution. I think there's a reason why for the first 13 years Muslims were persecuted, so they could know and understand what it's like to be persecuted. Because when you're persecuted, you become empathic to other people that are persecuted. So that for me is very important. My ancestors came here fleeing religious persecution to the United States as Catholics, right? I also come from largely an Irish background, and if you want to weep tears of blood, read Irish history about the Irish persecution, right? So, everybody has their narrative. Everybody, except white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But everybody has a persecution.
That's very Irish.
They have one, but it's false.
Everybody
The
has
Irish
a persecution.
revenge
Everybody has a persecution narrative. And if you can tap into empathy, which Jeremy Rifkin wrote an entire book on the importance of empathy as being foundational to human civilization, that we have to become more empathic as human beings. But this leads also to we have to learn grammar so that we can communicate with each other, because we've got people that, and the internet is the greatest proof that nobody knows grammar anymore, because all you have to do is read comments down there. So obviously if you can't write a grammatically correct sentence, to comment on grammatically correct sentences, we have a serious problem. Right?
But Hamza, I assume that, so often empathy is depicted as if it were the embracing of relativism. And of course, there are some people who do think that if you really want to be empathetic, you have to be a relativist. But I gather, even from the question, that obviously you reject that. I mean, you still think it's very important to make. You have to make a judgment about whether someone is or isn't.
We have criteria to do that. As religious people, we have very strong criteria. But desiring a sinner to leave his sin is empathy.
Yes.
It is. And even though people don't like that statement anymore, it's really been removed as an acceptable statement to love the sinner and hate the sin.
It happens to be true.
It's true. Yeah. For religious people, whether you believe in sin or not, those of us who do believe in it know how dangerous it is for the soul, because we believe in ensoulment, that we're more than material beings, we're spiritual beings, and the spiritual nature of the human being is profoundly affected by our behavior. I think, I really like Cormac McCarthy, but Cormac McCarthy talks about, the complicity of our behavior and how it affects people. People use illegal drugs in this country. They are empowering the beheadings of drogadores in Mexico.
Absolutely
they don't think about it. The people that are consuming pornography are empowering the traffickers of pornography that are involved in pedophilic pornography. So in that way, we are all sinners. And that sin is having a profound effect on us as human beings.
Yeah. It's painful.
John, you had a second
that
half of the question.
My cousin Guido will take care of you. I think just two quick points. One has to acknowledge that historically part of the problem with institutional religion, including Catholicism, Protestantism, and Islam, is that often somehow human beings get to make judgments that only God should make. I think with regard to the question of freedom, I think that one should look at the past period in which one can talk about the extent to which Islamic law, in theory, not always in practice, had far more of a pluralistic approach when it came to freedom of religion. Yeah. The challenge to Muslims today, and it is being faced, and Muslims are addressing it, not all, there is a vanguard, are dealing with the need to reinterpret in a new context. The problem is for ultra-conservatives, they don't do that. But for those of us of faith, of different faiths, we know those differences exist in all faiths. The differences between ultra-conservatives' approach to tradition and the way in which more, if you will, progressive voices do. You'll be okay.
Thank you. Needless to say, we could continue, and I wish we could continue this conversation. But we'll continue it another way.
With anything positive being said about progressive voices.
This has been a wonderful, wonderful panel. Thank you, Robbie, George, and friends.
Thank you.
Thank